Hello, everyone. It's loud. Hi. My name is Jay Ash. I'm the City Manager here in Chelsea. I welcome you all to another public meeting on the Silver Line Gateway study. I want to thank, before we get started, I want to thank all of the people from the state, MassDOT, and others who have contributed to the study and who are here tonight to talk further and engage our community about the potential. I want to thank all of the residents who are here for continuing to be engaged. There are many more, for one reason or another, who couldn't be here, who have been staying in touch with me by email and other sources, so I thank them all. We have members of city government here, including city councilors, Matt Frank and Dan Cortell, and I expect other city councilors to come in as the day proceeds, the night proceeds. So I want to thank the city councilors for continuing to be engaged in this process as well. I continue to be very excited about this project. There's Councilor Paula Barton. I knew that Councilor Barton would be here as well. I continue to be excited about this project and the opportunities it provides in Chelsea. Residents should know that since our last meeting, I have been meeting with representatives from MassDOT, and we have been talking to other stakeholders in the community, including businesses, to get their input and to continue to shape the presentation that is going to be before you tonight. I continue to be very satisfied about the public process and believe that the folks who are running this process are really listening and trying to take the best out of what everybody has to say to deliver a report that highlights what the very best service could be for the city of Chelsea. I know when I talk to people that there are slight differences of opinions about what route should be, and those opinions are important to hear. At the end of the day, I think we all agree that additional service is better than not having additional service, and I continue to be encouraged that this will provide the type of additional service that will benefit us all, both personally and in the short term, in the city and in the long term. So thank you all for being engaged, and I'm going to turn this over to Scott Hamway, who's been leading the review, and Scott has been in communication with me on a weekly basis, talking about what he has been uncovering, what it is that we, the residents, what it is that we, the citizens, want to see happen, and has been very responsive in everything that has been presented so far. So, Scott, continue. Thanks, and here you go.
All right. Thank you very, very much, Jay, for the introduction. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight. As Jay mentioned, my name is Scott Hamway. I'm with MassDOT's Office of Transportation Planning, and we're managing the Silver Line Gateway Alternatives Analysis Project. And really want to, echo what Jay said and thank everybody who made it out on such a pleasant night for tonight's meeting. Just want to quickly introduce a couple members of the team that are with us tonight. We have a consultant support by AECOM on this project. And just want to recognize Jay Doyle, who's the project manager for AECOM on the project. Will Calvis, also from AECOM, as well as Kerry Chase from Regina Villa and Associates over by the door. There was a survey that I think Kerry was asking folks to fill out on their way in, so if you haven't had a chance to do that yet, I'd invite you to stop by and see Kerry and pick up a survey. We do have Spanish translation available tonight, and I want to just ask Will, who's our bilingual team member, to come up and say a few words about that.
Okay, gracias, Scott. Bueno, bienvenidos esta noche a la reunión pública sobre el proyecto de la línea plateada. Y quiero decir tres cosas. La primera cosa, vamos a tener una presentación y después vamos a tener preguntas y respuestas. Y tenemos también, si quiere preguntar cualquier cosa en español, no es un problema. La segunda cosa es que tenemos una encuesta adelante. Está en los dos idiomas. En un lado es en inglés y en el segundo es en español. Y si necesita la encuesta en español, está en el otro lado de la página y está ahí mismo para poder usarlo. Y finalmente la tercera cosa es, por favor, tome uno de los audífonos si necesita el servicio de interpretación, que está aquí y puede ayudarte en la misma hora, al mismo tiempo, con la idioma, porque Scott vas a hablar en inglés esta noche. ¿Ok? Y gracias si necesitas algo. Scott, back to you.
Thanks, Will. Thank you. Okay, great. So we'll get right into it. So for those of you for whom this is the first time coming out to one of our meetings, the project that we're here to talk about would be a new branch of Silver Line service that currently serves South Station and the Seaport District, as well as Logan Airport. And this would be a new service that would connect over to this side of the harbor to East Boston and Chelsea. And we think this is a really great project, and that there's a real need there because, you know, if you think about the Seaport District in South Boston, that's where an overwhelming amount of employment growth has been occurring and is expected to continue to occur over the next couple of decades. At the same time, on this side of the harbor, we have, you know, very densely populated residential communities, and not just dense communities, but also communities where a lot of folks are already relying on public transit for their mobility needs. So we see this as a really logical link. At the same time, we've also had a number of, you know, major public infrastructure investments over the past decade and a half that make connections between these locales possible where maybe, you know, 10 years ago they wouldn't have been. Up on the screen here at the bottom, you just see where we are in the public process. This is our third public meeting in the process. At our last meeting, with your assistance, we sort of whittled down the alternatives that we're evaluating to 3, and the purpose of tonight's meeting is really to report back to you on the technical analysis that's been conducted over the past 2 months on those 3 alternatives. And then just peeking ahead in September, after the summer, we hope to bring everyone back together again in this room to propose a recommended alternative to try to advance into implementation in this corridor. So you may have seen the study corridor map when you came in the room, but just to walk folks through it again, the Silver Line the Silver Line Gateway project would do all of the same things that the existing Silver Line services do in downtown and in South Boston. So for those who aren't familiar, the Silver Line starts in South Station in downtown Boston, travels through the South Boston Piers Transitway Tunnel and serves a couple of subway stops in South Boston before traveling through the Ted Williams Tunnel and over to Logan Airport. But whereas the existing Silver Line route serves the Logan Airport terminals and connects folks there with the Seaport and South Station, the Silver Line Gateway would not serve those terminals. This would be a new route that would, instead of going to the terminals, it would go directly to Airport Station on the Blue Line and provide a link to both the East Boston residential community, which currently lacks Silver Line access, and also to folks coming, you know, down the Blue Line from neighborhoods to the north. From that point, it would continue in the Coughlin Bypass Road, which you can see up there near the top of the map. That bypass road was constructed last year by Massport, and it's basically a commercial vehicle and transit road dedicated to those uses. So that bypass road would allow the Silver Line Gateway to really kind of speed along its way over to the Chelsea Street Bridge, which is another new project that was completed last year. And then as you cross the bridge into Chelsea, that's where all of the questions and alternatives were that we were exploring at the last meeting. So these were the 3 meetings that kind of evolved out of that public meeting and also out of the other sort of stakeholder research stakeholder outreach that we've been conducting over the past few months. And just quickly, the first alternative would be a busway to Mystic Mall. So it would make use of an abandoned or an unused railroad right-of-way that kind of travels across Chelsea and with a terminal station over at Mystic Mall where the Market Basket is. A second alternative would be a shorter version of that that would go only as far as right here in Bellingham Square. And then a third alternative was the attempt of the third alternative was to see how good of a bus service could we create on Chelsea city streets by making some accommodations for bus travel where we could to kind of speed the trip through the city on local streets. So what I'll do now over the next several slides is just take you one by one through those 3 alternatives and describe the alternatives that we evaluated over the past 2 months. This is the alternative 1, busway to Mystic Mall. So you can see at the bottom right of the screen, that's the Chelsea Street Bridge, kind of touching down in Chelsea at the Eastern Avenue, Central Avenue intersection. The busway would, the Silver Line would enter the busway in the vicinity of the Massport employee garage before traveling along the backside of Bellingham Hill, passing underneath the Broadway Bridge and Washington Avenue bridges before passing the commuter rail station and ultimately ending up over at Mystic Mall. And as you can see on the screen there, where we envision there being 4 stations on this alternative in Chelsea, and I'll take you quickly through those 4 stations now. So and I want to point out too, we're still very preliminary phase of the project, so these station locations are meant to be sort of illustrative. They're not set in stone at this point, but these were this was sort of the team's opinion, and then with input from stakeholders and from the city on where the best locations for stations would be at this point in the process. So I mentioned that as the Silver Line would come across the Chelsea Street Bridge down here, it needs to get into this unused railroad right-of-way, and the easiest way to do that, we determined, was to make use of the Massport Employee Garage turnaround loop, which you access off of Central Avenue. So basically we're proposing that the Silver Line would come across the Eastern Avenue intersection and turn right into the Massport employee shuttle loop, but then we would basically build a busway off of the end of the turnaround loop and enter the railroad corridor from there. And what you're seeing there are 2 BRT, that stands for Bus Rapid Transit, which is what the Silver Line is envisioned to be. And these would be 2, an inbound and an outbound platform just to the north of that turnaround loop. And the reason we wanted to have the station right there is because there's already there's a lot of activity at that turnaround loop. It's well lit. There's people there. It felt like a sort of a safe and comfortable place for people to wait. And then it would continue on the busway to the north. Sure. Yep. Which property, miss? Do I press the? Right here. Right. So the way we've laid this out, Miss, and sounds like we should talk, afterwards. But the way we've laid this out, and this is a rough diagram, so the lines may be fatter than they would be in reality. But we've laid it out to fit within the boundaries of the MassDOT property, the MassDOT right-of-way that was purchased from CSX. Yeah, right. We do have so you're with the produce distributor, right? Yeah. So. Right. So there is a temporary license there where that's been paved and you're using it. Right. So yeah. Clearly, that use would not be the temporary use. The license that was granted would not be compatible with this project. But the way we've designed it is to fit within the right-of-way that MassDOT owns in that corridor. And we've got questions, from interested parties on the other side of the right-of-way as well, who live at Mill Creek, and we've intentionally designed this to not be in private property through this corridor here. Okay, great. So then moving on to the next station. So the next station we would envision to be behind all of that new residential redevelopment that's happened on Garish Avenue, or is continuing to happen, what branded as the Box District. So the station would be just at the end of, Highland Street has that little stub end that goes through that new residential development. The station would be just at the back of Highland Street there, on that railroad right-of-way, and that would be our second station under this alternative. Then we'd go under the 2 bridges and end up over at the commuter rail station. And under this alternative, we're envisioning a station that would be sort of a shared commuter rail and Silver Line station at the existing location of the Chelsea commuter rail station. And this, one thing to point out here is anybody, I'm sure everybody's familiar with Chelsea commuter rail station. It's not the prettiest station in the system. It's not up to the MBTA's, current design standards for commuter rail stations. And it's quite likely that, even touching that area with this project might trigger a full kind of rebuild of that station to bring it up to, modern MBTA commuter rail standards, and that would come at, a not insignificant cost. So that's something that we'll be kind of paying attention to as we go through the project. But the thinking here is that somebody could come off the commuter rail from the North Shore, transfer to this service, or vice versa, and you'd have a nice seamless transfer to commuter rail. before heading over to the final station on this first alternative, which is the Mystic Mall station. So the thinking here is that we'd stay in that right-of-way, railroad right-of-way. We'd cross Everett Avenue, and the station would be located sort of right at Everett Avenue, but on the Market Basket, side of Everett Avenue, adjacent to the commuter rail tracks. There's a variety of ways we could then turn the service around, so it could, turn around and start its inbound trip back into Boston. We've met with the sort of Demula's folks who own the property to talk about various ways that we could do that. But however we do that, the customer's experience would essentially be the same. The final stop or the first stop, depending on your perspective, would be right there in the Market Basket parking lot over by Everett Avenue. So that's alternative one. The second alternative, what we were trying to do with the Busway to Bellingham Square alternative is, that first alternative I just showed you it skirts along the edges of Bellingham Square. I mean, both the Box District Station and the commuter rail station are pretty close to Bellingham Square, but there's not that strong visual connection. Transfers to local buses wouldn't be as direct there. So we decided let's come up with an alternative that has the advantages of being in the railroad right-of-way, but tries to get right into the heart of Bellingham Square. And the way that you do that is by serving the same two stops that the first alternative would serve, but then after crossing under Broadway behind St. Rose, we would basically build a ramp to take the service up to that little last section of Chestnut Street by the fire station, just over here, and then come down Chestnut Street and then loop City Hall with a station, right in Bellingham Square before turning around and then heading back towards East Boston and South Boston. So this alternative would not have that Market Basket, Mystic Mall connection. It wouldn't have the direct commuter rail connection, but it would get you more into the heart of Bellingham Square. And the only new station on this alternative that we didn't already go over would be the station at Bellingham Square or at City Hall. And when we started looking at this, the easiest thing to do would be to just serve the current Bellingham Square bus stops. The inbound stop across Washington Ave here, and then the outbound stop at the community college. But in order to serve both of those stops, because of the one-way streets, buses would have to travel all the way down to 3rd Street or Everett Ave and then loop their way through downtown. So we tried to think, is there a way that we could shorten up that distance to make it a kind of a quicker turnaround for the service? And we came up with this concept. It might be challenging for me to describe, but basically under this scenario, we would have the Silver Line, instead of serving the existing bus stop here on Washington Ave, the bus would make that U-turn around City Hall and basically stop on the Broadway side of City Hall. Now the challenge there is that buses, at least our buses, have their doors on the right side of the vehicle, so you can't serve the curb in front of City Hall because the doors are on the wrong side. So to deal with that, we proposed a bus platform or bus station that would be built basically in the street, sort of one lane in, and that would be where you would wait for the Silver Line service, and the bus would come around City Hall, swing around, and then hug the curb onto Broadway, and the station would be right there. And it would also have the benefit of kind of protecting the Silver Line service from congestion and traffic on Broadway. We're really at the early stages of looking at this concept, and we need to continue to talk with the city about it. But that was our sort of best solution for how to prevent the Silver Line from having to kind of circumnavigate the whole downtown Chelsea. And again, it's early on, but this is also a solution that at least in theory could work for the other buses. So maybe you move all of your Hawthorne Street bus stop activity, the 111, 116, 117. Maybe there's an opportunity to funnel all of those routes into this new what we're calling an island platform. So that was alternative 2, the busway to Bellingham Square, and then our third alternative is what we call the OnStreet Alternative. So again, the goal here is to say let's avoid busway construction, and let's see how good of a connection, how good the service could be just on Chelsea city streets, and with some bus accommodations, some dedicated lanes or signal priority to try to smooth the trip. And the route that we've designed for that, and those of you who were at the last meeting saw a version of this. You would come across the Chelsea Street Bridge and then follow Central Avenue down into downtown Chelsea, with a stop in downtown Chelsea, a stop at Highland and at the garage on the way down Central, stops in downtown Chelsea, and then continuing over to a terminus that would be not exactly in the Mystic Mall, but just across Everett Avenue over by the MGH facility, with a stop on Spruce Street. So the way you make an on-street alternative work without getting stuck in all the same traffic that existing bus service does is you have to get creative, and I'll just quickly highlight a couple of the elements that we proposed to make this service work better. At either end of Central Avenue, you might be able to pick up that there's a solid yellow line in one direction at either end, and these are basically 100-foot long, 200-foot long bus lanes that would be at the end of each end of Central Avenue, so that a bus approaching the Chelsea Street Bridge would be able to essentially jump ahead of the line at that intersection and be able to kind of jump ahead of any congestion that had backed up on Central Ave approaching the bridge. Or at the other end of Central Ave, buses heading into Chelsea would be able to kind of get ahead of that congestion that can sometimes happen, right at the end of Central Ave before the turn onto Hawthorne. So probably the biggest element to make this work, we think, would be to implement a dedicated bus lane on Hawthorne Street between Central Ave and Bellingham Square. Obviously, there's a lot of competing uses in there. You've got small businesses, you've got parking, you've got a cab stand, you've got a lot of traffic. But we think that when you look at the volume of people moving through Hawthorne Street on a daily basis, about 40% of the people moving through Hawthorne Street are actually moving through it on buses. So even though buses are a relatively small share of the vehicles that are traveling Hawthorne, if you're more concerned about moving people than vehicles, that you can make a strong argument for trying to provide some dedicated bus accommodation for vehicles here. And again, that's a type of improvement that could benefit the 111, the 116, the 117, as well as the Silver Line. Another big change would be on 6th Street. In order to get over to the Everett Avenue corridor without, again, traveling all throughout downtown Chelsea, we've proposed on 6th Street to create a contraflow lane just for buses. So this would be one lane that would allow buses to travel in the opposite direction of traffic. So today traffic comes down 6th Street towards Washington Avenue. This would allow buses only to travel in the opposite direction. We do that in the South End in Boston with the Silver Line Washington Street service for a few blocks, and then you see some orange there. That's showing that even in the on-street alternative, we think we might want to hop onto the railroad right-of-way that MassDOT owns, just to kind of make a better connection over to Spruce Street for the terminal station. And then these next couple slides just, this is showing how a station at Highland and Central would work. You'd have outbound and inbound platforms at either side of the intersection. There'd be a parking impact there. All of these bus accommodations that I'm describing have an on-street parking impact. That's the challenge of implementing these improvements. This shows you what the final station would look like. So there's quite a bit of width on that block of Spruce Street by the MGH facility. So the thinking is there'd be room there for buses to pull over. You could build there'd be enough room there for vehicles to lay over, and then also to board inbound passengers at the beginning of the route. And while it's not on the Mystic Mall Market Basket property, it is sort of right in the heart of all that redevelopment that's happened over on the Everett Avenue corridor. The hotels, Mass General, the FBI coming in. And then these just show you what those bus lanes would look like. This is as if you were driving down Central Avenue into downtown Chelsea. This would be that last block. We propose to just have a little bus lane there that would allow buses to get ahead of any congestion in the corridor, and that would come again at the expense of parking for that block. And then this is what that Hawthorne Street change would look like if we were to dedicate a bus lane for that 2-block stretch of Hawthorne Street coming into Bellingham Square. This is what that would look like. So those are the 3 alternatives. I could either take questions on them now, or I'm getting pretty close to the end here. The remainder of the presentation basically just shows you the results of the analysis that we did over the past 2 months on these 3 alternatives. So maybe we could run through those results and then take questions. You know, we can go back to the alternatives later. But what we were comparing the alternatives for were these things. You know, how fast would a trip be on these 3 alternatives? How do they compare to each other for travel time? How many riders are we likely to get for each of these services? What are those parking impacts? You know, particularly for the on-street alternative, how much of an impact would there be there? And then, you know, at this early stage, what do these look like from a capital cost perspective? So before we started our analysis, we wanted to try to make it as much of an apples-to-apples comparison as we could. So these are the assumptions that were carried forward across all 3 alternatives. So on all 3 of these alternatives, you'd have service running every 10 minutes during the peak, every 12 minutes off-peak. The fare would be the same as the Silver Line service charges today in South Boston, so it would be a $2 fare with your Charlie card. It would run the same span of service as our subway rapid transit system does, so trips would start, you know, after 5 a.m. and run until after 1 in the morning. And then the goal here on this project under any alternative is to have off-board fare collection, so you don't have those long waits to try to board the bus at Bellingham Square that you see with people boarding the 111 or 116 over here on Washington Avenue. We're trying to design a system that would allow us to open all of the bus doors so people could just flow in and out of the vehicle like they do on a subway vehicle in downtown. And the vehicles that we've proposed for the service would be the same 60-foot articulated vehicles that you see running in South Boston today. So this is the travel time comparison. And what we did here on the left side, we just used some example, you know, beginning and ends of trips to see what the trip time would look like. If you look at the bottom 2 rows, which are Airport Blue Line Station to World Trade Center in the Seaport, and Airport Blue Line Station to South Station, you'll notice that they all have the same travel times there, and that's because, as I described at the beginning, all of these alternatives are doing the same thing. Once you get to East Boston, they're all traveling the same route. And but you can see right there for the travel time, for example, from the Blue Line at Airport Station to World Trade Center, you know, that's really a game changer for as far as access to the seaport from that neighborhood or from the Blue Line. You're talking about a 7 to 11 minute trip, depending on whether you're talking about the inbound or the outbound, and that's a real dramatic improvement over what the travel times are today. You know, one thing that's interesting to note on the top 3 rows showing travel times from downtown Chelsea is that there's not a dramatic difference between the alternatives. You might expect the on-street alternative to do a lot worse than the busway because it's going to be dealing with some traffic and traffic lights, but they kind of come out, you know, pretty close to each other in terms of travel time. You know, one thing that's important to remember is that on the on-street alternative, you know, the time we measured here was basically from that last stop before you would turn onto Central Ave. And when you turn onto Central Ave, you've kind of already gotten past most of the congestion you're going to run into in downtown Chelsea. So that's one of the reasons why the on-street, I think, looks as good as it does here. You know, other things to keep in mind. Only the Busway Mystic Mall alternative, and to a lesser degree the on-street alternative, actually take you over as far as the Mystic Mall and Market Basket. So they're not all doing the same thing beyond downtown Chelsea. But anyway, those are the travel times. And again, to get from where we are today over to the Seaport District, where all those jobs are being created, you know, to be able to do that in 20 minutes, give or take a few minutes, that's a pretty big change over what the situation is today. So, that's how they compare to one another. And then the next question is, how do they compare against the services that are already out there? We went through this at the last meeting, but if you're trying to make a trip from Chelsea to the Seaport District today, you have a variety of options. You've got the infrequent commuter rail trip to downtown, and then a few transfers. You've got the 111 kind of battling congestion on the Tobin, and then again a few transfers downtown. Or you can take local buses into East Boston and take the Blue Line into town, and then you still are left with either a long walk or multiple transfers. Whereas the Silver Line Gateway gives you that direct connection with no transfers right into South Station and the Seaport. This slide just makes that comparison. The left side shows you some of those paths I just showed you, how the trips are made today via the 111 and commuter rail and Blue Line. And it's clear that these are travel times to World Trade Center, to the Seaport District. It's clear that the Silver Line Gateway alternatives, all of them are a significant improvement over the current travel time to get over there. All of them allow you to get over there without a transfer, and most of them we expect would be more reliable than the existing service, other than commuter rail, which is pretty reliable, but not so frequent. This slide shows you ridership estimates, and these were conducted using the Central Transportation Planning Staff, or CTPS's regional travel demand model. And when CTPS does demand forecasts for us, they do them in an out year, in a model year, and it's typically 20 to 25 years into the future. So the year that these estimates were done for are 2035, and you can see from that second column there, all three of these alternatives are envisioned to carry either in the neighborhood of 7,000 to over 8,000 passengers per day. That puts them up in the top 10 to 12 bus routes in the whole MBTA system as far as ridership, clearly in the same category as the key routes. And even if you're just comparing them against other Silver Line services, it's on par with the airport Silver Line ridership. In fact, the Busway to Mystic Mall alternative, which has that highest ridership at 8,700, that would be, that's higher ridership than the Silver Line airport service is projected to get in 2035. The third column is pretty important, new transit trips. So that number, it may not seem big to folks, 2,000, 2,500 new transit trips a day. But when you think about the sort of wealth of transit options that these communities already have, this is a transit-rich community. You've got a lot of options already. A lot of folks are already choosing to use transit or have no other option but to use transit. So to generate that kind of number of new trips per day is actually a pretty significant increase. And then, what's happening to the other services that the MBTA operates? A lot of that ridership for existing riders is coming out of the existing bus routes. So you see the 111, having roughly 2,000 fewer riders per day. The 116 and 117 combined having 1,500, 1,900 fewer riders a day. I want to emphasize that all of those routes would still be very high ridership routes, even without these riders that they're losing. But anybody who uses these routes on a regular basis knows that that's good news for those bus routes, because those routes can get very crowded. We were actually out at Chelsea Collaborative the other day for a meeting, and we had a 111 had to let us go. We weren't able to get on the first bus that came by because it was so crowded. So we see that as a good thing, that it's pulling folks off of these routes. And then you see a little bit of an uptick in Blue Line ridership, and we think that's probably people in Revere, Winthrop, Orion Heights, who are trying to get to the Seaport District, who maybe are getting there some other way today. Maybe they're driving, or maybe they're not making the trip. But this service would make that a more attractive alternative. So parking, we talked about earlier. The Busway to Mystic Mall alternative, that's one of its advantages. There's no parking impact there, so that's something it's got going for it. The Busway to Bellingham Square alternative, the one that just comes and loops City Hall here, that has a more modest parking impact. A total of 29 spaces would have to be removed. However, if you look at the last two columns, which are measuring the utilization of those parking spaces, those those appear to be higher demand parking spaces that would be lost under that alternative. The on-street alternative is the bottom row, and that clearly has the biggest impact on parking. If you think about those dedicated bus lanes at either end of Central, dedicated lanes on Hawthorne, the contraflow lane on 6th Street, it adds up to 80 parking spaces lost. And while the columns on the right would suggest that that parking is a little bit less scarce than it is in the heart of downtown, it's still clearly a significant impact in terms of parking. And then this is my last slide, I think. So at the last meeting, I was kind of pushed to give just a general ballpark cost estimate, and I think I danced around the question a little bit at that meeting. But we're at a point now where we're comfortable sharing, very, very preliminary cost estimates. These are capital costs, and I want to just emphasize again that we're still in the planning phase. We're not in the design phase yet, so these are very preliminary. That being said, we tried to be as conservative as we could. For example, on that Busway to Mystic Mall alternative, that higher end number, the $70 million, that includes a full rebuild of the Chelsea commuter rail station, which, based on our recent experience building commuter rail stations, that can be $20 million or more just associated with that improvement. We also built in a pretty good sized contingency. There's a lot of unknowns at this point in the planning process. Once we get into design, we'll start to learn more about what's really out there. But we thought it was appropriate to sort of tack on a 40% contingency. So all of these costs represent our best estimates of various elements with a 40% contingency added on. And I should also point out that these costs they all assume that any vehicles that would be used for this service would be vehicles that this project would be responsible for paying for. So it's not assuming that we could find vehicles or some slack in the Silver Line service elsewhere and ship those vehicles here. Those are all costs that would be borne by this project. So we think these are, while very preliminary numbers, we think that they're very conservative ones. And then this is where we are again in the process. We'll continue to, we're interested to hear what you have to say about where we are tonight. We'll continue to meet with neighborhood groups or other associations that want to learn more about the project. We'll be back after completing all of our analysis. We'll be back at the beginning of the fall to share by that point a proposed recommendation for a project to try to advance forward into implementation. And then in the meantime, we need to continue to look at those issues that we've talked about throughout the process, identifying funding. Surprisingly, at least to me, the legislature still has not finalized its plan for transportation funding. That's kind of been hanging over the process. And then the vehicle issue that we've talked in the past about. The vehicles that are used in South Boston in that Transitway tunnel are very specialized vehicles. They're able to travel in the tunnel with zero emissions, and they're not a vehicle that's easy for us to go out and just procure more of today. So there's some strategizing on the vehicle issue that will continue to happen over the summer. So thanks for your patience, and I guess we can take questions. Yeah, thank you.
Just want to note that this is being televised. If you have questions, we'd like you to come up to the microphone here, and you can hold on to that microphone there. Okay. And given that I'm at the microphone, I'll ask the first couple of questions. Scott, can you go back to the travel time slide?
Sure.
And on the travel time slide, you have 23, 24, and 26 minutes from downtown Chelsea to South Station. Mm-hmm. The Busway Mystic Mall doesn't hit the downtown, so what's that calculation from?
So and again, they're all in different places in downtown. So the Busway Mystic Mall number is from the commuter rail station. So we treated that as the downtown Chelsea station for the Busway to Mystic Mall.
Okay, thank you. If you could, if you could go to the ridership number. Just trying to figure out how other routes are affected, and I thought that these numbers might add up, but they don't. So 8,700 people take the busway to Mystic Mall. There's only, and 2,500 of those are new trips, so if I subtracted that from the 8,700, I would expect to see 6,200 other people that are using other trips.
Yeah, well, so we could, yeah, so there's a much more detailed table that we could show that would have the impacts on the 112, the 114. Okay. There's even impacts on the red line and orange line as a result of this project, but they're, you know, we didn't want to try to put everything on the slide, and we thought that these were the routes and places that people would be most interested in.
Okay,
yeah.
good to understand that. So my most major question is if you can go to the slide that shows the alternative 2, which comes into Bellingham Square. And especially the slide that has it around City Hall. So I see how you create a bus platform there, and that's to allow people to get off the bus and be able to be protected from the traffic. I'm wondering if you had considered, instead of creating that infrastructure in the middle of Broadway, if you had considered, as the bus takes the turn off of Washington Ave onto Broadway, creating some opportunity to get over to the right-hand lane. I guess that would be a traffic signal there that gives the bus the preference so that the bus could get over right away onto the right-hand side. Seems like a cleaner, less expensive, more natural route. Was that considered and not decided to go forward with?
I don't know whether the team might have thought about that. I mean, that's not something that we had we ever kind of put on a map. But I don't know if Jay, if you want to talk about if there's anything you want to say about the pros and cons of that approach.
Yeah, we did look at Broadway, and one of the concerns is to have sufficient curb length to accommodate at least 2 of the 60-foot articulated vehicles. And so that was one issue, to have a continuous stretch of unbroken curb for passengers to board and alight from the vehicles. On the right-hand side of Broadway, it's discontinuous because of the intersecting streets on the right. That was one issue. The other issue was that the buses coming from Washington Avenue getting onto Broadway, they then would have to get over to the left pretty quickly over onto City Hall Avenue to make the return trip. So that was another difficult move that we thought if the buses could stay to the left, that have greater length of continuous curb for boarding and alighting and less weaving through the general traffic.
Understand the second, the last point that you made. With that last point, though, the 116 and 117 would be coming down Broadway, would now go into the left-hand lane and then have to get over to the right to continue on down Broadway. I assume that you assume that that's an easier movement than making a more extreme left-hand turn.
Well, one of the operational issues that we're still working through is which of the existing routes would use this new island platform on the left-hand curb, which ones might stay in what would become, would still have 2 general travel lanes on the monument side of Broadway.
And not stop. It's possible that the 116, 117 would continue into the travel lane, not stop at the monument, and would instead utilize a stop before and a stop afterwards for people to board.
That's one possibility. The other possibility we're looking at is possibly adding additional curb space on Washington Avenue in a fashion similar to what we see at the front of City Hall, but
Okay.
on the back side of City Hall.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Joseph Prolatonda. I'm a city councilor here in Chelsea. You gave the how many millions of dollars it would cost to do this. Does the T have carte blanche to whichever one they want, or because one is between 40 and 70 million, they're going to pick the lowest one because it's cheaper?
Right. So right now, and again, we've kind of said this, made this clear throughout the project. You know, we don't. This isn't a project that's already got capital funding committed to it. It was a project that our MassDOT and the governor's Way Forward transportation plan identified a pot of money for bus rapid transit and bus modernization projects of $100 million. This is a project that we always expected would be one of the projects funded under that line item. That there's still uncertainty, obviously, with what number the legislature is going to come back with. But I want to just make that clear that we still haven't identified the funding for the project. That being said, Secretary Davies made it clear that even absent getting all of the resources that were requested from the legislature, he's very committed to trying to make something happen in this corridor, in the near term. But clearly, cost is always going to be one of the considerations. But I think in this case, not that any of these projects are inexpensive; they're all expensive investments. None of them are in the sort of mega project category that the Green Line extension or South Coast Rail are. And the difference between the most expensive option and the least expensive here is it's 2 or 2.5 times more expensive. It's not a huge, it's not a wild difference in cost. So I don't think that cost would be the primary decision point for us on this.
Yeah, because my main concern would be losing 80-plus parking spaces. Right now, parking's at a premium here in Chelsea, and we have a resident parking program in place right now, and it's still tough for people to park. And depending on which way that bus route goes, I mean, if we're going to be losing parking spaces, that's not going to work out for the residents here. If it takes another route, say it goes by Mystic Mall, that could be another problem too, because what about all the other people that are coming in and out of other cities, coming into Chelsea, that want to get on that bus route to go to the seaport or to go to the airport? Are they going to be taking up spaces on residential parking somewhere? Are they going to be taking spaces from DeMoulas parking lot? I mean, where are all these extra cars going, and where does that leave us as residents in Chelsea for us to park?
Right. Yeah. Well, I just want to make clear I took down the OnStreet Alternative board, not because I'm saying we don't want to do that one anymore, just so I could see, you, Councilor. But yeah, certainly that's another factor, right? I think that there are situations where we think making an improvement for, again, the thousands and thousands of bus passengers, most of whom probably are Chelsea residents, sometimes is worth taking some parking. But clearly that's politically challenging. I mean, that can be a harder thing to implement, and that's something we need to consider as we look at the three alternatives as well. As far as folks from outside of Chelsea coming and parking to use this service, the first thing I would say is that would be, I'm initially excited about that concept because that means that we've designed a service that's good enough and reliable enough and fast enough that people are actually driving to get on a bus, which I think is a different mindset than people tend to have in the MBTA service area today. You see people driving to get on the train, not so much the bus. So part of me would be excited by that prospect, but it is something that we do need to focus on. In fact, in our just informal conversations we had with the Market Basket Mystic Mall folks, that's a concern they have. On the one hand, they're very excited about the project and what it could mean for that part of Chelsea. On the other hand, if it's a really quick way to get to the seaport and the airport, will people from Everett and Saugus start driving down and using parking spaces in the Mystic Mall parking lot? So that's an issue that we're going to need to work with, both over there and then also in residential neighborhoods as well.
Yeah, because as Chelsea keeps growing and more hotels keep coming into the city and the FBI building coming as well, we're going to be losing more and more parking spaces. There's going to be more and more less residential parking as well. So everything's going to be kind of congested, and that bus may cause those problems. I mean, I see the prices up there of the 40 million, 70 million. That goes down to 20 to 25 million. Well, the 20 to 25 million, it's kind of in the middle there somewhere, which the T of the governor may say, okay, let's go this route here. And then it causes another problem because if it's going through Bellingham Square, then we have a bottleneck with all the other buses there and all the other people there. So that.
Yeah. Well, one other thing to point out too, Councilor, is that while the OnStreet Alternative has lower capital costs, what we didn't show today was operating costs. And actually, because because of on-street congestion and because it's a longer route that the on-street alternative would have to take, we'd have to have more vehicles out there to provide the same every 10-minute service. So from an operating cost perspective, the on-street alternative would probably show up to be the most expensive of the three alternatives. So we just showed capital costs today because we're still kind of working through the operating cost estimates, but that's another consideration. And then I'd be, I would need to, and I think it's important to point out too that, on that parking issue, I think it's important to note that, Chelsea's already a place that's got, it's a very transit friendly, it's a transit oriented development city, right? Because that's how it grew up. It grew up on its streetcar lines and its rail lines. We think that adding a new service that's as good as this, will help, maybe make it, marginally less critical to have access to a car in Chelsea. If you're someone that works in the seaport or works at the airport, a project like this can make it a little bit less, can actually help take some of those cars and some of that demand for parking off the street. Not maybe 80 parking spaces worth, but it does mitigate it somewhat by being a better travel option for a lot of folks.
Now, is it only making those two stops to the seaport and to the airport and then back to Chelsea?
Well, outside of Chelsea, the stops would be Airport Station, 3 or 4, depending on whether you're going inbound or outbound, 3 or 4 stops in the Seaport District, and then South Station. So that's where it's going.
Has the T taken a survey with the Chelsea residents to see that which ones would take that bus route compared to the ones that are taking the 111, 114, 116 now?
So a couple of years ago, CTPS conducted a system-wide rider survey, system-wide passenger survey. They conduct these every decade or a little, sometimes longer than a decade. And it basically samples every transit trip in the system and asks customers, while they're riding or while they're waiting for a service, where did you start your trip? How many different vehicles did you have to use to make your trip? How often do you make this trip? Where are you going? And that information is really, our best resource. And we have a lot of information from people riding the 111, the 116, the 117. We have a lot of information there as far as where people are going. The regional travel demand model, which CTPS maintains and which generated these ridership projections, that model is looking at existing land use, employment, employment, residences, and it's projecting what those land uses are going to look like 20 years from now. So the model is another tool that we use to try to figure out, okay, if there's going to be this many more employment opportunities on Everett Ave or in the Seaport District, and population growth in Chelsea and East Boston looks like this is what we estimate the demand would be to make these kind of trips. So, they're not perfect tools, but those are the tools we rely on.
And when do we expect, once we wrap this all up, when do we expect them to start the whole project?
Right, again, so it's not at this moment a funded project. So in September we'll have a recommended alternative that will come back to Chelsea to present, and then it's really we'll then really look to see what the next steps are and how what the opportunities are to try to implement this. Depending on what the project looks like, an on-street alternative is something that you could probably get up and running quicker than a busway project because there'd be that construction element to it. But again, there's that constraint with the vehicle fleet that we need that we use in the South Boston Tunnel, and until that's resolved, that might actually be the thing that kind of makes us have to wait a year or multiple years before we could actually get something going, depending on how that issue plays out.
And one other thing, will the T have any type of MBTA yard here to store any of the buses here, or are they just going to be coming in and going out?
Yeah, we haven't looked at that issue in any kind of depth yet, but I can say that that's an issue that's that's an issue that's at the forefront of a lot of the T's top folks in terms of their thinking today, is that we need to think about where we need to think about our existing facilities and their capacity to maintain and store vehicles going forward in the future. So I think that's something that we'll have to look at. The fleet that uses the Silver Line service today is garaged out of the Southampton garage in the sort of edge of the South End in Roxbury. Certainly to the extent that this service would use some of those vehicles, they've already got a place to garage them. But I don't think we've taken that next step to do an analysis of Southampton's capacity to accommodate, how many more vehicles could
Yeah,
Southampton
the only thing I was
accommodate?
worried about is if one of those buses breaks down, the Silver Line breaks down, and then how long would it take for another one to come in, or for a tow truck or somebody to maintain that, to get people to the seaport or the airport just as quick?
Yeah, it's an issue we have all over the system, to be quite honest with you. It wouldn't be isolated to this route, but I mean, the good news is that at least the way we've modeled the service coming every 10 minutes, it'd be a little bit less painful than if it was an every 30-minute route, if the bus broke down. That's,
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Councilor, appreciate it.
Good evening, City Councilor Paula Barton. Thank you for coming again. I have some are comments and some are questions. One of my biggest concern is that at the last meeting you asked the public which they liked better, and the public clearly stated that they didn't like the on-street one that went down Central Avenue. And when you're talking to us today, you're talking about that being the cheapest, 20 to 25 million, if I'm correct. And also, that's one of the ones that loses the most number of spaces. So I contacted some of the people I know who own businesses across from the Shirtliff School, who voiced an extreme concern about this, because there would be no parking for their businesses, even though there may be only 15-minute parking now. There won't be any parking there now. So I'm concerned, as Councilor Paratonda mentioned, just because it's the cheapest and we want to get this up and running the fastest, to me, that may not be the best for Chelsea. And I want you to know Chelsea often gets the wrong end of the deal, like we did with the Tobin Bridge. And those poor people who live underneath the Tobin Bridge are listening to noise and pollution all the time. And I don't want to see us do something that helps people get into the Seaport District but has a big price to pay. So that's my comment on that. And the other plans, I think it was Plan 2 that went down Eastern Avenue on the rail bed through the Box District, looped through Chestnut Street to Bellingham Square. I was wondering why you couldn't go down 6th Street on that. That doesn't show that you go down 6th Street to the commuter rail. And I thought that, why can't you combine that with alternative 3, I'm assuming it's alternative 1, I guess. With, maybe I don't have the right number, but you know what I mean.
So you're saying
I'm
why
right
not?
there. You're
yeah.
on the right slide for me now.
Yep. Yes. You're saying why not do what we're proposing, but then have it continue on and
Yes.
go over? Yeah. And that was something we were looking at one point, and it's certainly something that we can continue to consider if this notion of getting service directly into Bellingham Square is something that people seem to think is important, because that's really the biggest difference between the two busway alternatives. One of them, kind of skirts around the edge of Bellingham Square, doesn't get right into the heart of it, but gets you to Mystic Mall. This one takes you right into the heart of Bellingham Square. It would make the trip to or from Mystic Mall a little bit longer compared to alternative 1, because you would be doing that loop in Bellingham Square, and you would have, so there'd be that negative to it. It might not generate as much demand for people coming to and from Mystic Mall because of that added travel time to loop Bellingham Square. But it was something we did look at earlier, and there's nothing physically that would prevent us from.
My biggest concern about that is we have a new development going in right near the train station.
Yeah.
And
Up
Jay,
here.
how many people are going to be in that development on Hurd Street? How many units? 6th Street, thank you.
Yeah, that's right up-
238 units right there?
Yeah, right
And
here.
a lot of those people would probably like to have access this way to get into town, and it's just a little further away and down 6th Street. From City Hall to 6th Street, it's only like 1 or 2 blocks, so I'd like you to take consideration of that.
Okay, thank you, Councilor.
And there's another one about the turn of the existing turn. I guess this is self-explanatory. When you're going to go to the airport parking garage and use that to make a turn, is that because there's kind of already a bus stop there and it's pretty easy to make a turn there?
Well, so is this the right slide, Councilor?
Yeah, that's correct.
So the issue here is that the MassDOT-owned railroad right-of-way does something, again, not an exact drawing down to the millimeter, but it kind of follows this alignment, and then it had historically crossed Eastern Avenue to a railroad bridge that was next to where the Chelsea Street Bridge is. So the right-of-way does extend all the way down to here. But I think both in this process and then in prior planning work that was done as part of the Urban Ring project, determination was made that would complicate this intersection too much. It would add a fifth leg to this four-legged intersection by having the busway kind of start right there, and it would cause congestion problems on all the other approaches to the intersection. So the feeling was, let's come across Eastern Ave and then use this access point. It's kind of consistent with the use that's happening there today with the shuttle bus operation.
Okay.
But again, requires coordination with the private owner of that garage as well as with Massport's.
All right, so the biggest one of my concerns is to extend that slide that I mentioned to you to go down to the T station.
Right, so to
Commuter
look at a hybrid between the first two alternatives that would serve that. And then just on your first point, Councilor, we've certainly heard
The
your concerns.
parking is a big problem in Chelsea, and I do have to say, at first you came and you told us it was going to start at 5:30 in the morning and it was going to be every 7 minutes. And now I'm hearing you say that it's going to start at 5 o'clock in the morning, which is earlier. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think that what the span of service is intended to show is just that this isn't a service like the 114 that doesn't run all day long. This is a service that's going to run like the 111, like the Blue Line. It's going to start, somewhere between 5 and 5:30 in the morning will be the first trip, and it'll reach the end of the line at the end of the night somewhere between 1 and 1:30. So it's not.
But if it's on public streets like Central Avenue, it's going to cause noise for the residents and the kids that go to school there. So that's why that one's not an option that I would like to see because of the time there and the frequency that it would be there.
Right. Yeah, we've heard those comments. Thank you, Councilor.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Hello, my name is Roman Pucko. I'm the commander of the Polish American Veterans in Chelsea. At the last meeting, City Manager Jay Ash wanted a real direct route. And seeing this project is not funded, and part of their study, can we run a diesel bus, regular diesel bus, from Bellingham Square, taking a left up Bellingham Street, all the way to Eastern Avenue, and then over the Chelsea Street Bridge to Airport Station. Also, and this is flexible, maybe go to Terminal E and drop off the passengers so they can take the Silver Line to South Station.
So just on that, was it Roland or Roman?
Roman.
Roman. Yeah. So what you were suggesting is coming out of Bellingham Square, taking Bellingham
Take a
Street,
left up Bellingham Street.
and then Eastern Ave to Central. So I guess the councilor has sort of just expressed concerns about bus traffic on Central Avenue, which actually already has some bus traffic. I would imagine those concerns would be amplified on a street that doesn't have any bus service today, like Bellingham. And I know that also Bellingham Street kind of goes over the crest of the hill there, which is a challenge, can be challenging for some of these vehicles to get over, particularly in a snowy situation. As far as your second point about going to Terminal E, we've heard other suggestions to do that, but again, I think we feel like this project's primary benefits from the Chelsea perspective. I mean, one of them is getting to the Blue Line potentially a lot faster than the 116, 117 can get you there, but it's also that connection over to the seaport and South Station, and to sort of have to travel through the airport roadway system, which can get very congested. We felt like that would just sort of unnecessarily slow the trip down. I should point out, too, that Massport is in the process of finishing their new consolidated rental car facility at Logan. And when they open that up, I believe within the next 12 months, they're going to have a new shuttle system that basically operates every minute to 2 minutes from Airport Station. So getting to Airport Station from Chelsea means you're going to be a minute away from boarding another bus that'll take you to whatever terminal you need to get on. So those are my.
So we should really consider service from Bellingham Square to Airport Station.
Oh, okay, so you're talking about with diesel. You're talking about if the vehicle issue is
I don't
resolved.
care what, but diesel, and to me, to do it now is part of the study to see ridership, to advertise and see if you're going to get the ridership that you anticipate.
Yeah, and I certainly think if you were running traditional buses at the frequency we're talking about as part of this project from Bellingham Square to Airport Station, that would be a service that would get good ridership. You know, in the planning phase, you try to shoot for the moon and try to plan it the way you'd really like it to be. And I think that once we get past September and we start to understand the realities of our fleet and the realities of our budget, you know, maybe we start to explore some ideas like the one you mentioned, Roman.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mark Ibunya. I'm a transportation blogger and resident of the Boston area. First of all, I commend you for Alternative 1, considering the fact that it has the opportunity to undo the significantly maligned perspective of the Silver Line as being an international example of how not to do BRT because of what happened through the South End. So I significantly commend you for everything that's in all of these alternatives. I am already hearing a lot of concerns about parking that I've heard about in research in many BRT opportunities across the world, including the US, and I certainly hope that you can prove and that's one of the big things that I'm hoping that CTPS can provide is possibly recommending realignments of bus routes with these alternatives to see if improving those routes instead of maintaining them as they are, like the 111 and so on and so forth, but to feed this bus route to improve the transit accessibility of Chelsea itself and not simply provide alternative ways for people to drive into Chelsea and have to park here. So is that within the scope, or would that be something that the CTPS can even provide for the MBTA going forward?
Yeah, I think, you know, again, in this phase of the analysis, we didn't try to complicate things too much by talking about how you might reorient other services within Chelsea. You know, but I think your point's a valid one. It's something that we should be considering if this project advances. I think that, you know, if you think of the big three routes in Chelsea, 111, 116, 117, if you think about where they go and the types of trips they're serving, I think the 116, 117 probably would be a more likely service to maybe see if it makes sense to move some of those trips once they get into Bellingham Square onto the busway, because a lot of those riders are trying to get to Bellingham Square, but then they're trying to get to the Blue Line. So to the extent that this is a quicker way to make that move, maybe it makes sense. At the same time, a lot of the folks using those bus routes are also they have destinations on Meridian Street in East Boston. They're not necessarily going all the way to the Blue Line. So you wouldn't be able to move all service, I think, away from Meridian Street. You'd have to do some kind of reconfiguration of the service. The 111, on the other hand, it's kind of serving a different trip pattern. It's taking people into the north end of downtown. It's taking them to the orange and green lines directly. That's a service that I see kind of serving a little bit different origin destination than 116, 117, or than this busway would.
Cool. And the Alternative 1, would Alternative 1 enable is that assuming that that cost, is that assuming that the right-of-way is electrified and allows the dual mode buses to re-engage electric on the way and reduce the noise that it makes through the neighborhood?
That was not something that we included in that cost estimate. So this would, whatever vehicle technology we'd be using, whether it's the dual mode articulateds that do run on electric power in the tunnel, whether it's some hybrid vehicle or battery vehicle that's able to hold its charge long enough to make it through the South Boston Tunnel, that was not part of this. That was not something that we captured in these costs for the busway.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
You're right, this thing is
I know.
really...
Maybe I should move the easel as well. So
I could just pull around. I'm Ann Houston, and I'm the Executive Director of the Neighborhood Developers. We have, with the city and Mitchell Properties, spent the last 7 years building the box district. It was an industrial area before that. And so unfortunately, this is the first of these hearings that I've been able to come to. So I just have 3 questions. First, on Alternative 1, and I should say we're really excited that you're beginning to move this process forward. We think it is in general a really wonderful thing for Chelsea. We think it'll help connect people to jobs that are really well suited to this city and to the new Seaport District. We would love to see a stop, the Highland Station stop. It's been something we've been thinking about since we first conceived of the box district. In our studies, we believe that you can include a walking path as through. There's one pinch point, and so I'm just wondering if that's something that you're considering as part of that section of the route.
well, it's certainly something we've been mindful of throughout the process. Again, it's not something we tried to capture, we didn't carry the costs for such an improvement in those cost estimates you saw. And I think, in our analysis of the issue, we certainly think that the right-of-way, from the box district down to Eastern Ave, there seems to be, through much of it, a sufficient space to be able to accommodate both uses. We also know that the city has expressed an interest, as well as Mitchell and Tregorth or whatever properties it is, an interest in a pedestrian connection down from Broadway.
That's right.
To the vicinity of where this station would be, or to the beginning of a shared use path. So, we're aware of those. We've been working with the developers to make sure that, we're able to make these things happen. But, the PED connection, we view that as, again, not something that we think this project would carry the cost of, because we do think that the walking route via Garish to Highland is pretty direct as is, and but certainly PED access from Broadway would be a plus.
And we think that what is really critical is that the design accommodate the ability to include that green path, the pedestrian walkway, alongside the designated route, and we think that there's room for that. So it is more that the designs will actually accommodate that, and we can work further on funding. Okay, so that was my question on number one.
Great.
On number two, if we could go back to the City Hall picture, please.
The bus stop in City Hall, the loop, yep.
I confess I don't understand it, so I just want to see if I could. Are you basically removing one lane of traffic in front of City Hall?
Yeah, so this would, and again, this was just very preliminary design, but again, the notion is to use the existing Bellingham Square stops. You have to do that long move down to City Square and Chelsea Square almost, and come back up. And there's a lot of traffic there. And the buses have doors on the right side, so you can't just hug the loop and pick up on the left side. It's conceivable.
I understood all that.
Yeah.
I just physically are you going to have something built in that lane of traffic?
Right. So I guess the way that, and I was walking out there to see it again for myself, to kind of try to envision it. As you would come around that corner, right now you have parking. I don't know, if it's 8 parking spaces or however many you have in front of City Hall there. So under this scenario, that would probably have to go away. The buses would kind of fill. The buses would travel in that what's today the parking lane, and then you would have a bus platform or berth that would be built in the street, kind of as an island, think of it as a traffic island or a median. But it would be, whatever this design width we would need to have a safe waiting space for folks. There'd be crosswalks connecting it across Broadway, and then the traffic would be on the other side of that island. Today, at least on this block, you don't have any on-street parking on the other side from here to here, because this little island where the monument is, you've got the bus stop is there, so there's no parking. So it didn't look like there'd be a huge, if any, parking impact on the right side of the street. But in order to make it happen, you would need to, most likely clear out all of that parking. So it's another parking impact.
So leaving parking aside, and I just want to note the sort of T-shaped building we have recently purchased and are in the process of.
This?
Yeah, we'll be renovating that, and we'll continue to own it. Just okay. So, well, and we own property scattered throughout this entire area. So, I just want to express some real concern. I think this is one of the craziest traffic patterns in Chelsea as it is, with traffic coming in from a number of different angles. It is, particularly in the morning and sort of at the end of the day, already pretty chaotic. And to narrow that traffic it concerns me. So I just say that if you go this route, I would hope that you would really do a lot more study about the impact. And I guess I think that I'm not convinced that bringing the traffic through Bellingham Square, bringing additional traffic into Bellingham Square is a critical feature. I think, the other stops are relatively close, and it's just a few blocks walk to the commuter rail stop from here. So I think there could be some real quality of life improvements not to bring more traffic into Bellingham Square right now. But so that would be something I would hope would be tested a little more. And then the third one was just a question about on Alternative 3, the parking. I had someone who used to be on my board 4 or 5 years ago drop in to visit yesterday. He lives right a couple streets over from Central Ave, and he was telling me about how difficult parking had gotten in the neighborhood, and asking, he likes to come and say, Ann, can't you do something? Ann, do something about this. So he was saying, and so when you were talking, I was wondering, would you ever consider doing some kind of alternative parking arrangement as if you went, that would offset any loss of on-street parking?
That's a concept that we've looked at in other projects. It's not something that we've started to explore as part of this project yet. We're kind of just looking to see what alternative makes the most sense to advance at this point. But certainly that's something that I would imagine would be on the table if we got to a point where we were recommending a parking loss kind of heavy alternative. But yeah, I mean, we recognize we've dealt with this on other projects. Parking, it's a painful thing. It's a very emotional issue for people. At the same time, I live right across the river in East Boston, and East Boston and Chelsea are really of the parts of Boston that are this dense and this crowded. These are really the last two neighborhoods like that where you actually can still find parking. If you're in Charlestown or South Boston or the North End or Beacon Hill, just forget about it. No one even expects to be able to find an easy parking spot. These are really the last two very hyper-dense communities where people still have that expectation. Down the road, will these neighborhoods go the same way, where that's something people are going to have to deal with? I don't know, but it's an emotional issue, and one we're obviously going to have to work with the city on before we advance any alternative that has a parking impact.
I live the parking battle on a daily basis, believe me. And so then my very final question is, would there be some sort of accommodation in the same way that Chelsea residents can go over the Tobin for a reduced price? Would there be some accommodation for residents who might want to hop on at Highland Street and go to Mystic Mall to shop?
Yeah, so what I would say is I think the position right now would be no. As far if you're talking about special fares, I mean the proposal right now is that this would operate the same as the rest of the Silver Line service does on this side of town, where you have a rapid transit fare basically for any trip, even if you're just going from South Station to Courthouse, or you're going from As I'm saying this, I'm remembering that we're not, because Massport's picked up the tab, we're not charging people at the airport to come inbound. So I'm remembering that. So I want to make sure.
It's that Charlie card.
consistent.
You could swipe.
Yeah.
You could have a separate swipe for.
Yeah, well, in the
So that'd be
past,
great.
that's something in the past. If you think of the Green Line service, the Green Line in the tunnel in the Central Subway downtown has always been a subway fare.
Yeah.
Under prior fare structures, if you were just traveling from like Boston University to Alston, that would be a bus fare under previous fare policies. But I think we're trying to move away from having all these little one-off fare policies. So.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
Hello, my name is Robert Letramoy. I'm a private citizen from Cambridge. I've been working on the urban ring since 1985, and I have 2 years railroad experience. I'm here to see how this fits into the overall whole because it clearly is a major project, and it looks quite good. I have been quite pleased with your presentation, and I want to thank you for it. One suggested improvement. You had a graph in which you compared travel times between this proposal and the competitive modes. Your travel time is to the World Trade Center station, or at least, this one's a South Station. That's much better. Okay. I was looking at thinking of a different table you used, which didn't seem to go beyond World Trade Center. Going to South Station makes excellent sense. That was my only point.
Yeah, right. We did have another slide. I think maybe it was this one where we were focusing on this example. We were just focusing on the travel time to World Trade Center and comparing existing service travel time.
Yeah, I think this one could be improved by going to South Station.
Yeah, well, I think if this was based on travel time to South Station, I think you'd start to see that difference narrow a little bit. So that I think the Silver Line would still be the quicker way to make that trip, but the gap would start to narrow a little bit. So maybe we cherry pick this one. But this shows you.
You've got a distinction which us transit mentalities understand. I think you're stopping at World Trade Center Station because you're going from outside bus to your electricity and your subway. But that's my point. I would prefer that this go to South Station.
Okay. Thank you.
Matt Frank. I'm actually a Chelsea City Councilor for the other half of the city. I'm almost as far away from the development as you can get and still be in Chelsea. I would say I don't really like alternative 3, and I would like to ask, did you guys look at the capacity at night? Because I realize during the daytime, Central Ave in that area might not have as high of a capacity as some other areas. But in the evening, I believe it does get quite crowded. So I don't know if you have any evening numbers in your extended forecast.
Yeah, so, admittedly, when we did our analysis and we had members of the team basically come out on a couple of occasions and actually monitor the activity at those parking spaces, and that was done, as this table shows, that was done during daytime hours, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. So clearly, yeah, and particularly in residential areas, that's when the demand peaks is in the evenings. On the flip side, it's also when maybe the need for some of these dedicated lanes drops off because you don't have the same level of traffic congestion. Although it can be challenging to design an improvement, a temporal improvement that's only going to be in place during the daytime hours and then reverts to something else at night. But it can be done. It's done in other places.
Well, if people had to be up by 5 o'clock in the morning and move their car, I'm not sure if that would happen.
Yeah, no, that sounds too early to me. I think there's probably a point at which traffic congestion starts to be a factor in Bellingham Square, and at the approaches on either end of Central Ave, it's probably sometime after 5, but maybe not that much later. But that's why I think the temporal changes like that don't work well sometimes. But we haven't really looked at them too closely, and I don't think we really looked at the overnight parking, which is clearly when, like on a place like Central Ave, clearly where it's probably going to be most in demand is at night when people are home.
Yeah, because I know Central Ave is very similar to my neighborhood. In my neighborhood, you can go find a parking spot right now. You can have a party, 50 people can show up, no problem. 10 o'clock, it's packed. You couldn't find a parking spot if your life depended on it. So I would encourage you to look at the overnights in that area. I do have a question about the traffic study for number 3 again. I just don't see how those numbers add up, because I know a lot of us come to meetings at City Hall at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and I can tell you I'm oftentimes stuck in traffic for 15 minutes just getting from the 7-Eleven, which is about a couple blocks away, to City Hall. I realize I don't have my own lane yet, but I wonder, when did you look at, what times a day did you check those numbers?
Well, I can defer to Jay on the traffic issue if he thinks he wants to step in here. But when we did the travel time estimate on the, for the on-street alternative, we were assuming that there'd be that dedicated lane on Hawthorne. So I think that seems to be where a lot of the congestion happens. I'm on the streets kind of south of the paint shop, and heading back to the McArdle Bridge a lot more. And it seems like congestion, if the bridge isn't open, congestion usually isn't so bad on what is that, Pearl, and it starts to really back up when you get to Hawthorne. So that alternative was modeling a dedicated lane there, which obviously helps a lot. Was that?
So that was so how would that affect traffic for those of us who
what would be the traffic impacts for, and Jay, do we have information on what the traffic, have we gotten to a point where we have traffic impacts for other traffic yet under the various alternatives?
We don't have the details available yet, but on Hawthorne, for example, we're not taking away any general travel lanes. We're creating the bus only lane by eliminating the on-street parking. So with respect to general traffic on Hawthorne, we believe that general traffic should be able to flow as well as bad as it does now. The bus will be able to flow better because it'll have its own lane, but that lane is displacing on-street parking.
Okay. I do commend you guys on these maps, especially the transit-oriented developments. Especially at maps 1 and 2 with the box districts. I was actually on the planning board and worked with Ann quite a bit. She was up here a few minutes ago on how to redevelop that area. So it's great seeing that on 2 of the maps. It's great seeing the Easton Ave area with all of their condos on there. I do have a question about the Mystic Mall on that vein. I know in the past there has been talk about creating a mixed-use development at the Mystic Mall that's much larger in scope than there currently is. And I think this was back when the urban rings still kind of existed out in the ether, having an urban ring stop over there as part of that big development. Has there been any, in your discussions with the Mystic Mall, not the Mystic Mall, the Mullers family in the Mystic Mall area, has there been anything like that brought up, turning that into a bigger mixed-use development using the transit as a focus?
Well, the focus of our conversations with the DeMollis folks was more on the logistics of how we might have to use their parking lot to turn buses around, or do we extend the busway kind of behind their property? We were primarily focused on those kind of operational issues at this point. At the same time, they clearly seem to view the project as something that could enhance their property and make other uses in the future more viable. But we didn't really get into a detailed discussion of what specific vision they might have.
Yeah, because my concern would be if that wasn't encouraged. Like currently, everybody talks about the commuter rail. The commuter rail doesn't have much going on around it. It's a residential neighborhood. And it's kind of a shame to have a train stop that's surrounded by level 1, residential 1 housing. Whereas anybody who's ever played SimCity knows that you want to put your really big buildings around your, or anybody who was on the planning board, or if you happen to be, the planning director, you want to put your bigger buildings near your train stations. So that is a concern of mine, that I wouldn't want any of these stops to go to waste. Mm-hmm. So I would personally love to see that as a focus and almost as a selling point of this project, that the Mystic Mall area could become, a much bigger transit-oriented area. And I would just have one comment about taking away parking spots, once again, in Alternative 3, and the expectation of parking. I love the concept of bringing in new developments with people who don't expect parking. But Chelsea is a multi-generational city. I'm on fourth generation myself of former factory workers. Actually, some of my family are still factory workers. Many people in this room are multi-generational. So when somebody tells them that they shouldn't expect parking anymore in 2035, there's a good chance that even though some of those people aren't alive yet, their families have been here. So you're basically telling them, if you want to live on Central Ave where your family's been for 150 years, well, just don't do it, just leave. And I believe we should focus on the people who are going to move in the future, but there should be also some focus on, families that have been here or families that are just moving here. I know the Latino population has been growing in the city, and there's a lot of people who are in third and fourth generation. And it would be, I know I'm Central Ave, it would be a shame if you basically said you can't live here anymore just because you have to drive. And it would just be a shame to see that happen. But thank you guys so much. I love the maps, and I do have to say, are you guys still collecting
The survey?
the surveys?
Yes.
Because I know one of the earlier councilors asked if people have been surveyed, and they were surveying people at the door. So anybody who hasn't been surveyed yet, I know they were collecting surveys from everybody who's in the room. So make sure you fill one out. Thank you.
Thanks, Councilor. Appreciate it. Are you a councilor?
Hi, how you doing? I'm Dan Cortell. I'm City Council President, and I, like Matt, am in an area that is where I personally live. Although my district is pretty decent size, I'm pretty far from any of these specific locations. I reiterate what Ann Houston said. First of all, I thank you for coming, and I think I'm a proponent of the project. I think it would do very good things for Chelsea, and I'm glad to see significant efforts to work through issues that might come up prior to anything being firmed up. My personal preference is alternative one. I have concerns like in Houston of going through Bellingham Square. I think just logistically speaking in this area, same as Councilor Frank mentioned, if you loop around to this parking lot, don't get a space in the lot, and you've got to go around the circle again. I think logistically it's just difficult. My preference is alternative one. I think it maximizes the use of the property, of DOT's property. It's also consistent with the rapid transit part of it because it basically avoids city streets to the best of the ability working with what we have. I would ask if, and I think you mentioned it isn't part of the plan you've looked into, but I think it's beneficial enough to Chelsea and also to surrounding areas that it actually would invite people to utilize it. I think the commuter rail station in Chelsea is underutilized, and it's really underutilized because there isn't parking. It's utilized by people who are in walking distance from the station. Coincidentally, my mother happens to be in town for a conference in Boston. Out of all the ways we discussed of her going to Boston, either paying for parking or taking the train, the commuter rail was not one that was discussed at all. And it should be in the conversation. I would like to know if it's possible for consideration at some point, especially if you do what my personal preference is alternative one, which is go to Mystic Mall. When you get out to that area, is there any possibility of adding parking? I think that what this side of the city versus the red line out on the other side of the city lacks is stations that have parking. And I think anything that the T does, I think when you look at ridership numbers and you're projecting them, you're looking at people who either are going to Boston another way using the T, people who aren't using it because it just simply isn't getting them fast enough, and people who might actually be invited to use it, including people in surrounding cities. We just instituted a parking program, and what we left to discuss to add to the program is possibly some rules that would basically prohibit people from parking on city streets and taking a bus into the city using, the 111. The concern is that something like this would invite that. If there was parking, like at Alewife and some of the other stations, the hope would be that wouldn't take place, and you would get what you're looking for, which is more widely dispersed ridership.
Yeah. So I would say just on that last point with parking, Counselor, I think I would compare this a little bit to a project we're doing on the other side of Boston on the Fairmount corridor. There's a commuter rail right of way that goes through Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan that we're building 4 new infill stations on, and I think that in a corridor like that or in other sort of transit-friendly communities like you have here in Chelsea, where there is a lot of density and the housing's most of it's pre-World War II, and it's built at a time when people had to walk to transit. We do sort of go in with not a lot of focus on parking initially because we want to design these services so that people will be able to walk to them, and that's the beauty of any of these alternatives. It's just the thousands of people that can actually walk from their house to the service. It's pretty high. It's not like going out into the suburbs where you really need that parking lot to make it work. So with that said, that's not building a garage component, for example, along with this isn't something that we're considering at this point. I would point out that there are significant sort of parking facilities at either end of Chelsea on the corridor, whether it's the Park and Fly lot, the Massport employee garage, and then Mystic Mall's significant surface parking lot. So there's already private property owners that are doing parking who perhaps for them it might make sense if this looks like a successful project. It may make sense for them to perhaps reprogram some of their own parking uses and charge for people to use this. That's a possibility. Even if that happens, or even if the MBTA were to build a parking facility, as long as you're charging for parking, you're still going to have that issue where we'll need to work with the city to figure out a way to make sure people aren't just parking on residential streets, because that happens all over the system where people will try to park on the residential street rather than to pay for parking if they think they can get away with it. So under any of these alternatives, even if there was a big new parking component to the project, we need to kind of work together to figure out a way to mitigate that happening.
No, and I very much appreciate your eye towards parking in all 3 plans, because it's always an issue here. We left out of the parking program those restrictions that would basically make parking on a city street and taking a bus in for a significant period of time. Obviously, if something like this happened, it's something that we'd have to seriously consider, because I do think that it would be utilized by Chelsea and people outside of Chelsea, and it does get you significantly faster. So I appreciate you coming. I appreciate your interest in doing it, and I look forward to further conversations.
Thank you, Councilor. Appreciate it.
Hello, my name is Deborah Washington, and I want to say that the Silver Line Gateway is going to be a great opportunity for Chelsea, and I thank you guys for coming in and considering Chelsea. I'm going to have just 2 questions. First, the alternative 1. I think that would be the best situation for Chelsea, because as stated previously by other speakers, our city is congested, our streets are congested, there's barely no parking, and this would sort of alleviate that problem. I'd rather have the movers deal with their parking situation than the residents of the city of Chelsea. I have 2 questions. Who will determine what alternative Chelsea would actually use? And the second is, what cost will it be for the city?
Right. So the way we'll reach a recommended alternative is we'll continue doing this analysis. We showed you some of the preliminary analysis results. So there's other impacts, like Jay mentioned, there's traffic impacts and other things that we still need to kind of work our way through, air quality impacts. So we want to have a full understanding of all of those impacts. That's one step. Certainly tonight's been an opportunity for people to weigh in and share their comments. I've been getting, Jay mentioned at the beginning of the meeting how there's a lot of people who aren't here today who are plugged into the process, and I know I get emails from time to time from city residents or other folks who've attended a previous meeting kind of letting me know what they think about the alternatives. We're committed, over the summer's not a good time for public, big public meetings, but
Right.
we're committed to being available. If there's a neighborhood association that wants us to come out and speak to them, if Mill Creek Condos wants us to come out and talk to them about the project, we're happy to do those sorts of things and get feedback. And then we'll also have our own kind of professional judgment on what makes the most sense from in terms of meeting all of these goals, air quality, ridership. We do have to consider cost, although again, that's not going to be the driving decision factor. So it's a real collaborative process, and we'll come back in September and present what we think we heard and what we think we understand about the three alternatives, and we'll present a recommended alternative. And if we got it wildly wrong as far as this group's concerned, I'm sure you'll let us know in September. But that's kind of how the process will work.
Okay, so we'll still have, I know what you said we'll have opportunities, but who will be the one to determine this is going to be 1, 2, or 3 for the city of Chelsea?
Again, I think
Is
of
that
it, yeah.
in collaboration with the city and with you guys, or?
Right. Well, the alternatives are kind of across a spectrum as far as some of them are things we can do significantly on our own property. Other things involve city streets. So clearly, under any element of any of these alternatives that are on City of Chelsea streets, we need to work with our partners at the City of Chelsea, and make sure that it works for them as well as for us. So it's a real collaborative effort. I think it's us working with the city, with the other stakeholders along the line, with folks that come to our meetings, with folks who are writing into us and emailing. So I think we're going to get somewhere in September that is not going to be a shock to the people. That if you come back to this meeting in September, I don't think you'll see us going off in a radical new direction. But it's a collaborative effort, and then ultimately the Secretary of Transportation, Rich Davey, will sort of give us guidance on when to move it forward, how to move it forward, and that'll all start in the fall.
Okay, so what would be the cost to the city? I know you'll be getting federal grants. I know you'll be doing
Yeah,
all
the
that
cost. Well, I like to think of it as the benefits to the city rather than the costs. But in terms of dollar costs, I mean, it's we haven't tried to quantify that. It's the types of things that would be cost to the city. For example, if we were taking away any metered parking spaces, that's a cost. Well, there's always the cost of lost parking in terms of just grief and political capital, right? If you take on-street parking, but if we're taking metered parking, then there's a financial cost to the city there. So that's a cost that is that something that we would have to make the city whole on? Is that something that the city would absorb because they're getting this transit improvement? The previous comments on parking concerns. Is the city going to have to ramp up its parking enforcement effort if there's a lot more non-resident parking happening? Perhaps the city has to redouble its efforts on that front, and maybe that costs more. But we haven't tried to quantify that. But the cost of the physical project, the capital cost, that would be funded through the state and federal dollars. It would not be the expectation wouldn't be that the municipality would be responsible for kicking in some percentage of that $70 million.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bruins game starts in a half hour. Anyone? Any other comments? No, I'm just joking. If there are any more comments, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I guess we're all done. So thanks everyone for coming out, and we'll see you in September.